Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And, we're coming off of this just joyous two-part mini-series on Christian nationalism, so I hope everybody's, all upbeat about that. No, seriously, I hope that's been helpful. But actually, the thing, Cameron's like, we left out a very crucial and critical part of the conversation, which revolves around how Islam plays into this whole conversation. So perhaps today's episode could be titled Muslim Nationalism, or maybe, but except that seems like a redundancy. Islam is a political system. So it's it'll be fun to tease this out with you a little bit, Cameron. I think we're at the point culturally where you can say things that are true without everybody running around yelling Islamophobia. We'll find out whether or not that's true. And I think those of you who have been listening to us for a while know we're usually pretty even-handed and measured in the comments that we make. But there are times in which you run into some ideas that you can say definitively, yep, I don't agree with that. And so let's talk about the role of Islam as it relates to, maybe you could just start in on Christian nationalism in general. Is it a response to that? But being maybe more broadly, not thinking only American-wise, but globally, why you feel like the role of Islam plays into the conversation about Christian nationalism.
Well, there's an irony when we talk about Christian nationalism, and we considered some of the better aspects of it. We thought about, we considered the fact that Christian virtues and values have sponsored some of our best civilizational efforts, if we're honest about it. And that's corroborated by people who are not necessarily Christians. Tom Holland is a recent example. Ayan Hirsi Ali, who has recently converted. So we talked about that. But then when we talked about the negative aspects, we talked about some dangerous trends and some misguided lines of thought regarding, getting more power and as Christians and doing so in more coercive methods. There was talk, even one thinks of Christopher Wolf's book, Christian Nationalism, where he talks about a Christian prince in the Machiavellian sense. So we highlighted some of that. There's integralism on the Catholic side as well. But Nathan, there was an irony, as we discussed in that second episode, some of the potential threats of Christian nationalism, because there is a much more serious threat that we are facing in the West. And so this was kind of the elephant in the room, and that is Islam. Well, yes. Well, I'll pause there for a second.
Yeah, let me set it up this way. I would imagine that the vast majority of you who are listening to this have good Muslim friends, neighbors, coworkers who are absolutely lovely people. That's been my experience, that if your kids go to school with Muslims or you're doing business, that's an all-around great experience in America. So I can categorically say some really lovely people are out there in the world who are Muslim, who also have a very, very different idea about what the best and most beautiful version of culture would be. So, Cameron, we were saying, hey, here are these things that we love about American culture that are gifts to us from the Christian faith, about the value of individuals, about God-given and then human rights, freedom of speech, the democratic, process. We're seeing those. However, if you're in another country and you talk to somebody who's a Muslim apologist, they're going to say the same thing about Islamic culture. Look at the beauty, look at the art, look at the literature, look at the civilizations, look at the academic history. This is the more beautiful vision and version of how reality ought to be. And so it's two separate cultural visions, but Muslims aren't Muslim because they think it's a bad vision. They think it's a good vision. And this is where it gets interesting. So years ago, I did an event. I know I've told you about this, but like the title of it, you can't make this up. So it was an atheist who had recently sued a local school board. It was a Buddhist, a lesbian rabbi, and myself on a panel at a college in New England. And the title was, "Can We Coexist?" And I argued that coexistence is not enough. But it sounds like the setup to a joke. But the guy who is Muslim, the Muslim imam, who was also part of this, that I sat beside, awesome guy. Nice family. I invited myself over to his house the next time I'm in that area. But he looked straight at me and he said, no. He said, absolutely, I think Sharia law is the best thing for the future of America. He's like, as a Muslim, that just makes logical sense. And I wholeheartedly believe that that is true. And that's the best vision moving forward. And I was like, and I don't. But I think there's a refreshing sense to some of those conversations where, particularly if you're in other parts of the world where Muslims are far more like, this is what we believe. It's almost like there's an American and then the rest of the Muslim world. When you're talking, like, talk to American Muslim, and they're often going to be like, oh, we kind of believe the same things. And there's a softer, more liberal, democratically oriented, progressive Islam that I would say is more popular in the States. But when you read the Quran or the Hadith, and then you talk to those Muslims, you're like, no, we don't. But then when you get over like into London and the dudes with the big beards, like those guys just tell you like you're an infidel, and the conversation gets interesting. So it's hard to wrestle with this ball of wax in an American sense, but I want to separate out the kindness of, and I think a lot of the shared emphasis on family, and things that we do appreciate about Muslims that we know. On the other hand, be very, very clear that it is a very, very different vision of who God is, what humans are, and how societies ought to be operated. And that is worth keeping your eyes open to.
Yeah, so let's make a critical distinction, and this one comes from our friend Dr. Andy Bannister. So he'll say there are millions of moderate Muslims. There is no such thing as a moderate Islam. So I think that distinction between Islam as a system of belief, and as you said, Nathan, Islam is a political vision as well. We'll press into that in a second. And then Muslim adherents who are, there's a clear spectrum there. So the reason, though, I mentioned that this is an irony is because Islam as a system of belief is a explicitly political vision, and it's a theocratic vision. So right. The notion that that it's a big threat that we have certain Christians on the fringe of political movements who are trending in that direction, when so that, I mean, you can take that seriously, but then you have this immigration crisis that's happening, and you have this vast influx of Muslim people, and this has been happening for several years now, not just coming in, but also setting up Islamic centers of study and mosques. We haven't talked about this in a long time, Nathan, but for a while there was a lot, it was in the news a lot, the setting up of Sharia courts, particularly in the UK.
In the UK,
that's a big deal because the Sharia, correct, yeah. So that's a big deal because the Sharia court doesn't operate according to the common law of the nation in which it finds itself. It operates according to the law of Islam. So it's a Sharia court, Sharia. So there are some serious issues that we need to take into account there, and this is why our friend Oz Guinness will say, the critical question, the civilizational question facing the West is whether we will see Islam reform. So yeah, those are some distinctions that can help us as we navigate this conversation.
One of the other, and this is not just Islam, but this is actually Islam is really good at this. So, I mean, I don't know if you've ever been in like a section, the Muslim section of London, like all the street signs are in Arabic, hijabs everywhere. I mean, you wouldn't know that you're in England because everything is fully in Arabic, and it's 100% Muslim. And so one of the interesting things about Islam as a system is that it doesn't want to play well with others and doesn't care that people disagree with him. It's not really trying to make converts. In the sense that maybe a more liberal democracy or a Christian-based idea is like, hey, let's try to live here in harmony and we can have our disagreements and get along. Islam doesn't have that same goal to it. I've been on this Napoleon kick, but one of the things that when Napoleon conquered Egypt that he loved and praised about Islam, he saw this was a good thing. And as Napoleon, so he would value this, but he's like, what's wonderful about Islam is it can destroy entire religions and cultures in 15 years, where it takes Jews and Christians 1,500 years to change it. And so he thought that was great, that, you could have a group that would just wipe out entire other cultures and people groups in a little more than a decade. And you see this happen with the rise of ISIS and the destruction of ancient art all the way up through the Arab Spring, in which, hundreds of thousands of dark documents and books and artifacts and everything are destroyed because, hey, look, these are considered to be idolatrous. Allah is great. He's the only one to be worshipped. So wipe out everything that disagrees with you and onward you go. So there's a sense in which I think some people would balk at that. But no, that's pretty much, now there is, so the plurality version of Islam is you can execute the people, you can have them, or they can live among you and pay a tax and work as second-class citizens to serve you. Those are, in a more fundamental sense, from the Quran and Hadith, what you get as your options for integrating other belief systems into an Islamic system. So you have to kind of decide and be able to say, that's not my preferred utopia.
So let me give you a case in point. And this was in the news several years ago, and so there's a good chance that listeners have forgotten about it because of the long string of controversies that have followed since then. There is always something new in the week to be basically attracting all of our outrage, right? But Nathan, do you remember? I'm going to mispronounce it. I try to do the French pronunciation here. That Charlie Hebdo. Remember? Oh, right. Remember the big controversy surrounding the satirical. Yes. So this is a satirical newspaper in France, in Paris. So this is a key illustration of what you were just saying about an unwillingness on the part of consistent Muslims, those who follow Islam, to integrate. So, and this is also a very powerful illustration of the differences between Christians and Muslims. So Charlie Hebdo has published for years and years all sorts of satirical cartoons, many of them poking fun at the Catholic Church in particular. So highly blasphemous images involving the Virgin Mary, on and on. They did this. So they took this same tack with a profane depiction of Muhammad, the prophet, naked in a compromising position. I won't go into all the detail there, but this is highly sacrilegious in Muslim terms. And, some devout Muslims went into those offices and promptly killed a bunch of the reporters and the people. So a couple of items that I want to single out here. These are notice the assumption was on the part of the French kind of intellectuals was that, all right, we have a lot of Muslims coming into this nation. We have a lot of immigrants. Well, they're going to become part of secular French society, and we can all coexist. And, in the same way that we coexist with these Catholics who we think are, we thumb our noses at them and laugh at them, but they take it. But that illustrates a complete and total misunderstanding on the part of Westerners when it comes to Islam, which is a religion of conquest. And so when it's followed consistently, when you have a devout Muslim, so I'm almost at the point now where I'm hesitant to use the term radical when it's
not necessary.
If you're following the Quran and the Hadiths, there's nothing radical. I mean, it is radical when you just isolate the behavior, but it's not radical when you look at what the motivations are. It's perfectly consistent with this system of thought.
Ooh,
you have that collision right there. Yeah, let's hear it.
Yeah, because the French mistake there is to assume that, and this is a danger that Christianity has to watch out for too, is the French publicist mistake there is that Islam is a system of belief. And for a Muslim, it's not. It's an entire way of life that integrates everything from how you use the bathroom to what you eat to what direction you pray. I mean, it is how
you clean your ears. My goodness. Yeah.
Right. So, and there's something to be said for a high degree of integrity and consistency. And so there's something to be honored about that. However, that's not going to fit in a Western liberal democracy where the assumption is that people can compartmentalize their beliefs and not have that impact the other categories of their life. And I think that's something that the church has struggled with, of reducing Christian faith into an intellectual category, but not having it touch other components of life, that suddenly people think, oh, you can be religious in this sense, but not in this category, where Islam has none of it.
So the other, somebody might say, well, we hear stories about Christians shooting up abortion clinics. We hear stories about Christians lashing out. You guys talked about some of the negative aspects of Christian nationalism. And so here I think it's important to bring in a note of clarity here. In those cases where you have a Christian lashing out violently, you can clearly show from Scripture, from the sacred text of Christians, that this behavior does not line up with the prescriptions therein. So in other words, this is an abuse of Christianity. It's not being followed out here properly. This is Christianity turned toward a misguided end. And sadly, yes, we do have abundant examples of that because human beings are fallen. That is not the case with an incident like the Charlie Hebdo. And there are many other incidents like this. You have recent stories, by the way, of Muslims beheading school teachers, for instance. That's a story that happened not that long ago. In those cases, it's not the case that you're going to be able to search the hadiths and the sacred texts and the Quran and the sacred texts of Islam and show that those actions were wrong. Just the opposite. You can show that those actions were justified and that they have divine sanction. Now, I'm not pointing that out. We are not pointing this stuff out to be discriminatory. We are pointing this stuff out to be very clear. One of the major challenges, we can lose sight of this here in North America. Because we're very concerned with a lot of our own cultural squabbles. We're very concerned with some of the controversies circulating around our neck of the woods involving transgender rights, all of that. I mean, and these are important issues. But the great challenge that we're facing in the West is that you have an influx of people, many of whom adhere to a system that is, when properly practiced, intrinsically incompatible with Western liberal democracy. That's the major challenge we're going to have to meet. And I tell you what, one crude way of putting this is Peter Kraft, is that Islam is conquering not by force of arms, but by force of mothers. These,
others.
They are having, way, way more children than we are.
Yeah, but
Europe has
a system that values family.
Decreasing populations.
That's
it's
not
a system that values family.
It's a system that's to be celebrated. Yeah. That's good. But I actually, so you're talking about,
yeah.
I was, you were talking about, so you were talking about Andy Bannister, which I would recommend some of his work on, intersection of Islam, Western civilization, Christianity. And then Nabil Qureshi is also a name that, particularly his book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, is a really helpful book. But Andy Bannister one time,
book. He was a good friend of ours.
Sent me and we might want to talk about him in a minute, but Andy sent me an article that was kind of joking, but kind of not, saying that if you fixed the birth and immigration rate in the United States, this was like 5 years ago, that in 200 years we would be an Amish majority country. So there's that, but I think that when I think of like hyper literal Christianity, I think of the Amish. When I think of hyper literal Islam, I think of ISIS. If I can use those groups as the opposite extremes of like, what if you tried to
Al Qaeda, and the reason, ISIS,
and the reason I can say that is from the friends that we have, and those who converted to Christianity, Cameron, have all said, if I was still a Muslim, I would feel that it was part of the fulfillment of the eschatology of Islam to join anything that supports itself as a global caliphate. I would need to go fight on behalf of this cause if I was still a Muslim. So it's not like Cameron and I are just like pulling clickbait right-wing stuff out of the back corners of the internet here. This is like people that we know, or have known, or Muslims who have said it themselves. So the funny thing about it is like Muslims are usually truthful people. Like they'll just tell you when you ask them, what's the goal here? So it's not like there's some kind of like nefarious dark web, shadowy kind of thing. Like pick up, and you will have the Muslim apologists who said, no, look, there are passages in the Quran that are very lenient toward other people. And then you go back and you read that passage and it says, and to the Jews he has said, and so, oh yeah, this is about how Jews are supposed to treat other people, not about how Muslims do. So there's a lot of it's a frustrating system to wrestle with, because as soon as you make a counterpoint, they'll be like, well, you don't speak Arabic, you can't know. And here's another great one. Unless it's in Arabic, the Quran isn't legitimate. It is a one culture, one language religion. It's not supposed to be translated into other languages.
Yeah.
And it's wild, like here, because Ramadan's coming up. I've been getting these YouTube ads of like a crash course in Arabic so you can understand what you're praying during Ramadan. And that's wild that, you could be praying things in a language that you don't understand, but out of the repetition of it and the devotion and the dedication of it, you just do that. Our friend Bill, he could crank off Arabic prayers like nobody's business because he'd been doing it before he could walk. But he didn't have a clue what any of them meant. And so, I mean, later in life he did, but that shows you something about I'm just saying it's not intended to be a multicultural apparatus. It's one language.
No, and the ads that I'm getting, Nathan, because I go to the gym and I'm into fitness. I'm getting the how to hold on to your muscle mass during the month of Ramadan. Just thought that was kind of funny. But
the Ramadan fast is not that big of a deal. It's only it's like intermittent fasting.
Right. Yeah, no, it is. It's intermittent fasting.
I think they say Muslims eat more food in Ramadan than any other time of the year. That is an important...
My experience with the friends I've known, it's true. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think there's a sadness to the whole structure too, where so you have there's some interesting opposites where Jesus talks about when you're fasting, don't let anybody know about it, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And so you're you're doing your acts of righteousness, not even letting your right hand know what your left hand is doing, because you believe that God is the one who provides justice and he sees what's done in secret. Some of you went to college or had friends who were Muslim during Ramadan, you knew about it. Because that was, so there's this odd external showmanship is not the right word, but a very flagrant need to make it known.
Well, it's legal. No, it's legalistic. Yeah. No, I mean, Islam, we would say as Christians, our view of it would be that it is legalistic in the sense. I mean, you have to go through all of these carefully coordinated motions. There are good aspects to it. I mean, religious practices can structure our lives in a very beneficial way, and they can shape the way we think. So we all have our liturgies that we go through. We can acknowledge that. It's one thing to have those liturgies and those sacred traditions and rites, rites, shape how we view the world and rejuvenate our imagination. It's another, though, when we see them as absolutely necessary for our salvation in terms of earning it. And that is so in human terms, I've often lots of people will say this. Islam makes a lot of sense. It's very straightforward. You have to, in order to, you have to earn your salvation. You earn your salvation by doing the right thing, and you try to appease Allah. And Allah is not like us. He's inscrutable. He's utterly beyond us. Allah won't even deign to be in paradise with his creatures, which also another interesting study in contrast, which shows you why something like the incarnation of Jesus Christ is viewed with absolute disgust by Muslims, who will immediately start asking questions that probe at the scandal of the incarnation. Did your God go to the bathroom? Did he brush his teeth? All of those. And the answer, of course, is yes. And some of us, it's instructive for us, by the way, to sometimes look or just tease out the implications of how amazing it is that the Lord of all creation took on flesh. I mean, it is huge, but that is an absolute scandal to a Muslim.
Yeah, I think the interesting counter to that is Muhammad was spectacular, and the whole historicity around Muhammad is a question in and of itself. But Muhammad was spectacular in the fact that he had the guts to come into the world and tell God how he couldn't be. And this is what Nabil often pointed out, that Islam is the religion that's built as an apologetic against Christianity. And that's why most Muslims would mop the floor with most Christians in a one-on-one debate, is because it's built as an antithesis and the whole idea of, there is no God but one is in direct, I mean, that is intended to directly contradict a more mysterious and more complex God. So there's a sense in which the latecomer gets to write the scriptures in a way that help choose the terms of the battle from their own direction. That's
one
another
way to get clarity here.
Well,
I was just going to
I was just going to say, it's interesting that when Jesus shows up on the scene, he says, all of the prophets before me were right. And Muhammad shows up and says, everybody before me was wrong. Those are two very different ways of beginning to think about how history and humanity and cultures are, how God works among people. So that's a rabbit trail to go down. But anyway, back to you.
Sure. I mean, but again, the reason we're bringing this up is not to be discriminatory and not to be fear-mongering or anything like that, but as responsible thinking people, this is one of the great challenges facing us in the West. And so we need to be thinking it through, because we don't have, at present, we don't really have many viable answers, I would say. Certainly they're not forthcoming from our current politicians. Policy is being, crafted to try to meet this challenge. For many years, of course, there's been this big push for efforts like multiculturalism, which has failed. Multiculturalism has been shown to be a failure. It does not work. Some form of integration, when somebody else comes into another nation, needs to take place. So, given everything that we've said so far, none of it may sound controversial. None of it is controversial. It's just drawn directly from the facts,
primary
of the matter, in the texts and news items. Yeah. So how do we think through integration for people who are committed to this kind of a political vision? Granted, not every Muslim is. In fact, many aren't, which is good news. But there are those who do have those thoughts. And again, many of our political naivete it's been used against us in the West. Muslims have used efforts like multiculturalism and all of that to establish huge Muslim think tanks in key universities. Now, is this some elaborate conspiracy theory? In a way, yes. These are strategic goals to disseminate and teach Islam. And some of the most helpful critics here, people like Ayan Hirsi Ali and others, are saying this. And fortunately, they are involved with the drafting of policy and thinking through this challenge. But one way to be informed on this and to kind of gain a responsible perspective, and this is really true of any belief system that you're interested in, is look at the founder. So, and Nabil used to say this all the time. So read up on Muhammad. And if you have the time, and maybe you should take the time, read a biography of Muhammad. It's going to be a very eye-opening experience for you. And because it will shed light on the ethos that we have here. It's the same way if you're going to study Mormonism, read up on Joseph Smith, or Scientology, check out L. Ron Hubbard. Or Christianity, who are you going to read up on Christ? Because you see these very different visions, and there's a clear political vision here, and we need to think about the way of life that we have here. And once again, Nathan and I have been making the case that essentially the West, as we understand it now, with its sensibilities and its moral vision and its conscience, is thoroughly shaped by Christianity. And sometimes it takes somebody who's a foreigner to show you, who doesn't adhere to that, does not think like that, their sensibilities have not been formed by the church, to show you, oh, I didn't realize that we've been, that how thoroughly Christian we actually are in our thinking. Doesn't mean we're all going to church, doesn't mean we're all reading the Bible, but we've been shaped by it. That's why, I mean, the key intellectual to point to here who got this better than anybody was Nietzsche, who just, he saw so clearly how thoroughly Christianized the West was, and he just seethed with hatred for it. And that's why his final project was called The Transvaluation of All Values, because it's interesting that he went crazy at the end of his life. I mean, there's you might say there's somewhat of a little bit of a warning parable there, but he recognized, look, we have to rethink everything from the ground up if we want to get away from the Christian conscience. But just some observations about our way of life here, why this is a very serious challenge we're facing, why we need to put our best heads together and really think it through prayerfully and responsibly as citizens, but most importantly as Christians who care about everybody, our Muslim neighbors, everybody who's in our neighborhood and our neck of the woods. And our neck of the woods looks increasingly diverse these days.
Which is part of what makes America great. I mean, so you know how much sleep I lose over this, Cameron? Zero. So
Same.
And this, so like, is it a threat? I mean,
but then again, you and I both think God's in control.
Well, there's
and that's a key thing. We think God's in control. So politics, So just that small matter of God's in control. Now that doesn't mean we abdicate our responsibility or anything like that. That doesn't mean. But Nathan, both you and I think would be. I think both you and I would say that in the end, political solutions are not going to be the main way this challenge is met. And that's Christians have always, and you're right, it takes us longer. Look back to what you said earlier. It's if you're going to persuade people with a knife or a sword, yes, you're right, it's faster. If you want people's hearts, it's going to take you a little while. So Christians, we're slow, and we talk to you about it. Muslims sometimes may resort to the sword, and that's faster, but it doesn't result in lasting change.
Yeah, and you can democratically elect a dictator. I mean, it's just a numbers game. So whether or not it's a sword or numbers, but the takeaway here, I'm thinking of the church in Nigeria right now. So we're talking about the doors being kicked open and everybody being shot on a routine basis. I get the little updates in my email of how many people were killed in church services. And the government says, well, this is a political tension. It just happens to be that it's all Muslims shooting all Christians and not the other way around. So, I mean, I don't know. Maybe you could read between the lines there and think there's interesting at least. But the church is growing. So you can't, I mean, if God is behind it, you can't shoot the Christians fast enough to stop the growth of the church. Now, that's an extreme version, but it's wild to read some of the theologians out of Nigeria writing and speaking on this of our worst. The threat of Islam in the U.S. is not comparable to the way in which the church has engaged in the past with this. And to be sure, every time that you're talking to a Muslim, they'll refer to Christians as crusaders and point to the Crusades. And there was a time in which the church,
of course,
did bless, grab your sword and go sort it out. But Cameron's point here is you can't find that in the teachings of Jesus. So that was a political maneuver with Christianity stuck on it as a bumper sticker, not out of the heart of Christ for how he wanted people to engage. I think, when I'm thinking about Muslims in the world around me, Cameron, there's a high degree of compassion and empathy that I have. It's, when somebody does something really stupid, and I use that word carefully, in the news under the name of Christ, and you're just like, oh, like I am now associated with that.
Yep.
Think how your Muslim neighbors feel most of the time when things happen in the news. And I think there would be just a very isolating, lonely factor of like, oh, great, now I have to kind of bear the reputation of this thing that is going on. Because by and large, most of the Muslims who are here recognize the deficiencies and the problems with the cultures and the political systems that they've come out of, and are absolutely thrilled to be here and super pumped to be contributing to our country, our economy, and our culture. And I think they have a pretty rough time at it. So there's a sense in which, as Christians, you can look at it and say, oh, culture is persecuting us because we're blamed for the stuff that other people do. Yeah. Well, try being Muslim. I'm sure that's not a walk in the park either. So I think fostering good friendships, like you said, the way out of this is not a political maneuver. It's going to have to be from the church doing churchy things. Jesus said, a time is coming when people will kill you and think they're doing God a favor. And we've watched that play out from the last 1400 years. So Difficulty? Yep. Something to keep your eyes open about? Yep. Reason to give up on going to church and worshiping the Lord in spirit and truth? Nope. But on the other hand, I think if there's one takeaway from this, Cameron, what I hear you saying a little bit, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is like, hey, all of you people complaining about Christian nationalism, get your head out of the sand and look at something that might be a little more significant of a problem if you're paranoid about the future of theocracy in the United States.
Precisely. Yes. So thanks for sticking with us through this conversation. Again, more can be said and more likely will be said, but we hope it's been helpful to you and we appreciate you. So thanks for tuning in to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
And just as a reminder, in case you're interested, in the archives of this podcast, there is a conversation with Dr. Andy Bannister on how to talk to your children about Islam and Muslims. So if you want to scroll back through our history there and you're new to the conversation and want to check that out, that could be a useful resource for you and your family.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.